Have you ever wondered what it would be like to discover an entire civilization that vanished without a trace? Imagine walking through the ruins of magnificent palaces, their walls still adorned with vibrant frescoes depicting scenes of impossible athletic feats and mysterious rituals. Picture finding clay tablets covered in an ancient script that no one on Earth can read, holding secrets that died with their writers over 3,000 years ago. This isn't fantasy. This is the haunting reality of one of history's most perplexing mysteries. Welcome to the story of the Minoans, Europe's first great civilization, and perhaps its most enigmatic disappearance. For over 1,000 years, they dominated the Mediterranean with their advanced engineering, sophisticated art, and powerful navy. They built palaces that would make modern architects weep with envy, created frescoes so vivid they seemed to move before your eyes, and developed writing systems that still confound our greatest minds. And then, in what feels like a historical blink of an eye, they were gone. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of archaeology's most captivating puzzles. We'll explore towering palace complexes that defy everything we thought we knew about Bronze Age engineering. We'll examine artistic masterpieces that reveal a culture obsessed with death-defying rituals involving massive bulls. We'll attempt to decode messages written in a script that has frustrated linguists for over a century. And we'll investigate the catastrophic events that may have brought this remarkable civilization to its knees. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. The more we uncover about the Minoans, the deeper the mystery becomes. Every archaeological discovery seems to raise more questions than it answers. Every breakthrough in understanding their culture only makes their sudden disappearance more baffling. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why the fate of the Minoans remains one of history's most compelling unsolved cases. So settle in, because we're about to embark on a journey through time to a world of impossible palaces, undeciphered mysteries, and a civilization that vanished so completely it was lost to history for over 3 millennia. This is the story of the Minoans, and their disappearance is about to consume your imagination. Around 3000 BC, while much of Europe remained locked in primitive Stone Age cultures, something extraordinary was beginning to stir on the island of Crete. Rising from the sparkling waters of the eastern Mediterranean, this strategically positioned landmass would become the cradle of Europe's first major civilization. The Minoans, named after the legendary King Minos of later Greek mythology, were about to change everything we thought we knew about ancient European development. What emerged on Crete wasn't just another Bronze Age settlement. This was a sophisticated maritime empire that would rival the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Minoans developed from local Neolithic cultures around 3100 BC, but by 2000 BC, they had transformed their island home into something that seems almost impossibly advanced for its time. Complex urban settlements began appearing across Crete, featuring architectural innovations that wouldn't be seen elsewhere in Europe for centuries. The Minoans weren't content to remain isolated on their island paradise. They were master shipbuilders and fearless sailors whose maritime empire stretched across the Aegean Sea and beyond. Their powerful navy allowed them to flourish without the massive defensive walls that characterized other Bronze Age civilizations. Why build fortress walls when you control the seas? For over a millennium, the Minoans lived in remarkable contact with all the major civilizations of their time, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the kingdoms of the Near East. But what truly set the Minoans apart wasn't just their maritime dominance. They were the first Europeans to develop a written language, known today as Linear A. They constructed the first paved roads on the continent. They created artistic masterpieces that display a refinement and sophistication that seems to leap centuries ahead of their time. These weren't just skilled craftsmen. They were civic engineers whose technical achievements would make modern city planners take notice. The sophistication of Minoan culture becomes immediately apparent when you examine their artistic achievements. Unlike the rigid, formal art of their Egyptian contemporaries, Minoan artists celebrated movement, nature, and life with an almost modern sensibility. Their frescoes burst with vibrant colors and dynamic scenes that feel alive even today. Marine life dances across their pottery in elegant, flowing designs that capture the essence of their sea-dominated world. Perhaps most intriguingly, Minoan art reveals a culture that seems remarkably peaceful and egalitarian for its time. Their frescoes show women in positions of apparent equality, participating in religious ceremonies and social gatherings alongside men. There's an absence of the warfare imagery that dominates the art of other Bronze Age civilizations. Instead, we see processions, festivals, and elaborate rituals that suggest a society more interested in celebration than conquest. The religious life of the Minoans centered around nature worship, with particular reverence for bulls, snakes, and a powerful goddess figure. Their sacred symbols appear everywhere throughout their art and architecture: stylized bull horns, called horns of consecration, double-headed axes, and serpentine figures that wind through their most important ceremonial spaces. This wasn't just decoration, it was a complex symbolic language that expressed their deep connection to the natural world. What's particularly fascinating is how the Minoans seem to view their relationship with nature. Rather than seeking to dominate the natural world, their art suggests they saw themselves as part of a larger cosmic order. This philosophy would manifest in some of the most spectacular and dangerous religious practices ever recorded in human history, rituals that would leave archaeologists scratching their heads for generations. The heart of Minoan civilization beats strongest in their magnificent palace complexes, architectural marvels that still leave visitors speechless today. The most famous of these, the Palace of Knossos, stands as perhaps the most impressive Bronze Age structure in all of Europe. Built over 3,500 years ago, this wasn't just a royal residence, but a thriving administrative, ceremonial, and cultural center that coordinated the activities of an entire civilization. Walking through the reconstructed ruins of Knossos today, you're immediately struck by the sheer ambition of its design. This multi-story complex covers nearly 6 acres, featuring over 1,300 rooms connected by a maze-like network of corridors, staircases, and courtyards. The famous red columns that support its structures aren't just decorative, they represent a completely unique architectural approach that defied conventional engineering wisdom of the time. Unlike the stone columns that would later characterize Greek architecture, Minoan columns were constructed from cypress tree trunks that were deliberately inverted. While this might seem like an odd choice, it was actually brilliant engineering side down. The Minoans, by placing the trunk up, prevented the wood from sprouting once installed, creating columns that were smaller at the bottom and wider at the top. This distinctive tapered design became one of the most recognizable features of Minoan architecture. But the true genius of Minoan engineering becomes apparent when you examine the infrastructure hidden within their palace walls. The Palace of Knossos featured elaborate drainage systems that would be impressive even by modern standards. The Queen's quarters included not just a bath, but a flushing toilet, a luxury that wouldn't appear again in Europe for over 1,000 years. The hydraulic engineering displayed throughout the complex demonstrates a level of technical expertise that seems almost impossible for its time. The palaces weren't just marvels of engineering, they were also centers of incredible artistic achievement. The walls were covered with vibrant frescoes that depicted everything from religious processions to scenes of daily life. Light wells brought natural illumination deep into the interior spaces, creating an interplay of shadow and light that enhanced the visual impact of these artistic masterpieces. Perhaps most remarkably, these palace complexes were built without defensive walls. In an age when most civilizations surrounded their important buildings with massive fortifications, the Minoans felt secure enough to leave their palaces completely open. This speaks to both their confidence in their naval dominance and their apparently peaceful relationships with their neighbors. The Minoans seemed to believe that their control of the seas provided all the protection they needed. The sophistication of Minoan palace architecture extended far beyond simple engineering marvels. These weren't just buildings. They were complex urban ecosystems designed to support thousands of inhabitants while serving as centers of government, religion, and commerce. The storage magazines within these palaces reveal the incredible organizational capabilities of Minoan society. Massive pithoi, enormous clay storage jars lined room after room, holding everything from grain and olive oil to precious metals and exotic imports from across the Mediterranean. What's particularly striking about these storage facilities is their sheer scale. The magazines at Knossos could have fed the entire population of the palace complex for months, suggesting a level of economic planning and resource management that rivals modern administrative systems. The Minoans weren't just living day to day. They were thinking strategically about long-term survival and prosperity in ways that seem almost impossibly sophisticated for their time. The religious architecture within these palaces tells an equally compelling story. Sacred crypts and lustral basins, sunken ceremonial chambers, accessed by steps appear throughout the complex, suggesting that religious ritual was woven into the very fabric of daily palace life. These weren't separate temples built apart from secular activities. They were integrated spaces where the sacred and mundane intersected in ways that reveal a completely different approach to spirituality than we see in other ancient civilizations. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Minoan palace architecture lies in their apparent theatrical areas. Large stepped courts that archaeologists call theater areas suggest that public spectacles or religious processions were regular features of palace life. The question that haunts researchers is, what exactly were they watching? What kind of performances or ceremonies took place in these spaces that were important enough to be built into the very architecture of power? The construction timeline of these palaces reveals something equally intriguing about Minoan resilience. The first palaces were constructed around 2000 BCE, representing the flowering of early Minoan civilization. But these original structures didn't survive. They were destroyed by earthquakes and fires, natural disasters that could have ended the Minoan story before it truly began. Instead, the Minoans rebuilt, creating even more magnificent second palaces around 1700 BCE that survived for centuries until their final destruction between 1500 and 1450 BCE. This pattern of destruction and reconstruction speaks to something fundamental about Minoan character. They weren't just builders, they were rebuilders, people who faced catastrophe and responded with even greater ambition. Each reconstruction incorporated lessons learned from previous disasters, resulting in structures that were not just more beautiful, but more resilient. The fact that they rebuilt multiple times suggests a civilization with deep roots and unshakable confidence in their future. Of all the mysteries that surround Minoan civilization, perhaps none captures the imagination quite like their most famous artistic achievement, the bull leaping fresco from Knossos. This stunning piece of ancient art, dating from the 17th to 15th centuries BCE, depicts something that seems almost impossible to believe: human athletes performing death-defying acrobatic leaps over charging bulls. The fresco shows three figures engaged in what can only be described as the world's most dangerous sport. One person approaches the bull from the front, another vaults over the animal's back in a spectacular display of aerial acrobatics, while a third waits at the rear, presumably to catch or assist the leaper. The athletic skill required for such a feat would be extraordinary by any standard, but in the Bronze Age, it seems almost superhuman. This wasn't just artistic imagination or mythological storytelling. The technique and detail of the fresco strongly suggest that bull leaping was a real practice, a ritualistic sport that the Minoans called taurokathapsia. The precision with which the artists captured the anatomy of both human and animal figures, the realistic depiction of movement and timing, and the presence of similar scenes throughout Minoan art all point to this being a documented reality rather than fantasy. But why would anyone engage in such an incredibly dangerous activity? The answer lies in understanding the deep spiritual significance that bulls held in Minoan culture. These weren't just animals. They were sacred creatures that embodied the raw power of nature itself. The act of bull leaping represented something profound, the tension between humanity's mastery over the natural world and the ever-present danger of that world's untamed power. Every successful leap was a triumph of human skill and courage over nature's brute force. Every performance reaffirmed the delicate balance between civilization and the wild forces that could destroy it at any moment. In a culture that lived in constant awareness of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and the unpredictable power of the sea, bull leaping may have served as both religious ritual and psychological preparation for the dangers of daily life. The religious symbolism extends throughout Minoan culture in ways that reinforce this interpretation. The famous horns of consecration that appear on buildings and artifacts throughout Minoan sites are stylized bull horns that likely represented fertility, seasonal change, and the cyclical nature of life and death. These weren't mere decorations. They were sacred symbols that connected the Minoans to cosmic forces they believed governed their world. The athletes who participated in bull leaping weren't just entertainers. They were likely religious practitioners engaged in a sacred act that required not just physical skill, but spiritual preparation. The fresco suggests that both men and women participated in these dangerous ceremonies, indicating that this was considered an honor worthy of the civilization's best and bravest, regardless of gender. What makes the bull leaping fresco even more remarkable is its artistic sophistication. The use of color, the sense of movement, and the emotional intensity captured in the faces of the participants demonstrate an artistic tradition that was centuries ahead of its time. The composite nature of the fresco, assembled from at least 7 separate panels, shows that this wasn't just a casual artistic project, but a major ceremonial work that held deep significance for Minoan society. The mystery deepens when we consider that similar bull-leaping scenes appear throughout Minoan art, from small seal stones to large architectural reliefs. This wasn't an isolated artistic theme, but a central cultural practice that defined something essential about what it meant to be Minoan. Yet despite all the artistic evidence, we still don't fully understand the rules of the sport, the training required, the religious significance, or even how many people survived these spectacular performances. The bull-leaping fresco stands as a perfect metaphor for the entire Minoan mystery. We can see the beauty, appreciate the skill, and sense the profound significance, but the deeper meaning remains tantalizingly beyond our grasp. Like the civilization that created it, the fresco offers us a glimpse into a world that was simultaneously familiar and completely alien, advanced yet mysterious, beautiful yet dangerous. These artistic masterpieces weren't created in isolation. They were part of a broader cultural system that included sophisticated administrative practices, complex religious beliefs, and social structures that we're only beginning to understand. The frescoes, the palaces, and the artifacts all point to a civilization that had developed its own unique solutions to the challenges of Bronze Age life, solutions that were working brilliantly until something went catastrophically wrong. But understanding Minoan culture requires us to confront one of archaeology's most frustrating puzzles, their writing system known as Linear A. Imagine discovering thousands of clay tablets covered in mysterious symbols, knowing they contain the thoughts, records, and secrets of an entire civilization, yet being completely unable to read a single word. This is the maddening reality that has confronted scholars for over a century. Linear A represents more than just an undeciphered script. It's a locked door to the Minoan mind. Used primarily between 1800 and 1450 BCE, this writing system appears on everything from administrative tablets and religious artifacts to gold hairpins and ceremonial vessels. The script consists of at least 90 distinct characters, including syllabic signs, ideograms, and numerical symbols that suggest a highly sophisticated bureaucratic system. What makes Linear A particularly tantalizing is that we know its descendant, Linear B, intimately. When British architect and archaeologist Michael Ventris cracked Linear B in 1952, revealing it to be an early form of Greek used by the Mycenaeans, scholars hoped that Linear A would soon follow. After all, about 70% of Linear A symbols appear in Linear B. It seemed like a simple matter of working backwards from the known to the unknown. But Linear A has proven to be far more stubborn. Despite decades of intensive study by some of the world's brightest linguists, the script refuses to yield its secrets. The problem isn't a lack of material. Over 1,400 specimens containing more than 7,000 signs have been discovered. The challenge lies in understanding what language these symbols represent and how that language functioned. Some scholars believe Linear A recorded a language completely unrelated to Greek, possibly connected to ancient Anatolian tongues, or even more exotic linguistic families. Others suggest it might represent an early form of a language that later evolved into something we recognize. The uncertainty is maddening because these tablets likely contain exactly the kind of information that could solve the mystery of Minoan disappearance, administrative records, religious texts, historical accounts, and economic data that could illuminate the final days of this remarkable civilization. The locations where Linear A tablets have been found tell their own story. Beyond Crete, specimens have appeared in mainland Greece, Turkey, and even Israel, suggesting that Minoan influence extended far beyond their island homeland. But what were these tablets recording? Were they trade agreements, religious ceremonies, historical chronicles, government decrees? The silence is deafening. What's particularly haunting is that we can identify recurring words and phrases in Linear A texts, patterns that suggest meaning just beyond our grasp. Some tablets appear to be inventories, others seem religious in nature, and still others might be correspondence or legal documents. We can see the structure of a complex society in these inscriptions, but we cannot hear their voices. The mystery deepens when we consider that the Minoans clearly possessed sophisticated record-keeping systems. The sheer volume of tablets suggests a bureaucracy that tracked everything from religious offerings to trade transactions. These weren't primitive people struggling with basic administration. They were running a complex civilization that required detailed documentation to function. Yet their voices remain locked away in symbols we cannot decode. Some researchers have attempted to crack Linear A using statistical analysis, computer modeling, and comparative linguistics, but the script continues to guard its secrets. Each apparent breakthrough leads to new contradictions. Each promising theory crumbles under closer examination. It's as if the Minoans designed their writing system to be permanently incomprehensible to future generations. The frustration for historians is almost unbearable. Imagine having access to the private thoughts and official records of a lost civilization but being unable to understand a word. These tablets might contain the names of Minoan kings, descriptions of their religious beliefs, accounts of their final struggles, or explanations for their mysterious disappearance. Instead, they remain silent witnesses to a vanished world. But even as Linear A maintains its stubborn silence, the physical evidence of Minoan civilization was building toward a dramatic conclusion. By 1600 BCE, something was stirring beneath the waves of the Aegean that would shake the entire ancient world to its foundations. Just 70 miles north of Crete, the volcanic island of Thera was preparing to unleash one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in human history. The eruption that would devastate Thera wasn't just another volcanic event. It was a cataclysm of almost unimaginable proportions. With a volcanic explosivity index of 7, this explosion ejected somewhere between 28 and 41 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, this was roughly 4 times more powerful than the famous Krakatoa eruption of 1883, which was heard 3,000 miles away and affected global weather patterns for years. When Thera exploded, it didn't just destroy itself, it obliterated the thriving Minoan settlement at Akrotiri and sent shockwaves throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The central part of the island collapsed into the sea, creating a massive caldera and generating tsunamis that may have reached heights of 100 to 165 feet. These walls of water raced across the Aegean at terrifying speeds, reaching the Cretan coast within minutes. The immediate effects on Crete would have been devastating beyond imagination. Coastal settlements would have been swept away entirely. The tsunamis would have penetrated deep inland, destroying harbors, shipyards, and the maritime infrastructure that formed the backbone of Minoan power. Following the waves came clouds of volcanic ash that buried everything in their path and toxic gases that poisoned the air itself. For a civilization built on naval supremacy, the Thera eruption represented an almost perfect catastrophe. The Minoans had spent centuries building their power on their ability to control the seas. Their unfortified palaces, their extensive trade networks, their entire way of life depended on their mastery of maritime technology. In a matter of hours, that mastery would have been rendered meaningless. The environmental effects extended far beyond the immediate blast zone. Volcanic ash and gases injected into the upper atmosphere would have altered weather patterns across the globe. Evidence from Irish bog oaks shows stunted growth patterns that suggest sudden climate changes around 1628 BCE, possibly caused by the Thera eruption. The effects may have been felt as far away as China and even North America. For the Minoans, the eruption would have seemed like the end of the world. Their religious beliefs, so deeply connected to natural forces, would have struggled to comprehend such overwhelming destruction. The bulls they revered, the sea they mastered, the earth they built upon all, had turned against them in a single, catastrophic moment. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. For decades, scholars assumed that the Thera eruption was the smoking gun that explained Minoan disappearance. The timing seemed perfect, the destruction was undeniable, and the scale of the catastrophe matched the mystery of the vanished civilization. It was a neat, satisfying explanation that tied up all the loose ends. Then science intervened with inconvenient facts. New dating techniques, including ice core analysis and radiocarbon dating, began suggesting that the Thera eruption occurred not in the 1450 seconds BCE, when Minoan civilization collapsed, but in the 1600s BCE, potentially 2 centuries earlier. If this revised chronology is correct, then the eruption couldn't have directly caused the Minoan disappearance. Even more puzzling, archaeological evidence shows that many Minoan sites actually experienced a building boom in the decades following the Thera eruption. New palaces were constructed at Zakros and Phaistos. Damaged settlements like Petrus and Palai Castro were rebuilt with even more impressive architecture, including high-quality ashlar masonry that represented the pinnacle of Minoan construction techniques. This evidence presents us with a fascinating paradox. If the Thera eruption was as devastating as we believe, how did Minoan civilization not only survive but apparently thrive in its aftermath? Were the Minoans more resilient than we imagined? Did they possess disaster recovery capabilities that allowed them to bounce back from even the most catastrophic events? Or are we missing something crucial about the timing and effects of these ancient disasters? The answer may lie in understanding that civilizations, like individuals, can often survive single catastrophic events, even ones as massive as the Thera eruption. What they struggle with are cascading failures, multiple problems that compound and reinforce each other until an eruption, may the entire system collapses. The TH have been just the first domino in a chain of disasters that would ultimately bring down Minoan civilization. What's becoming clear is that the Minoan disappearance wasn't a simple story of natural disaster, followed by immediate collapse. Instead, It appears to have been a complex, drawn-out process involving multiple factors that interacted in ways we're still trying to understand. The volcanic eruption may have weakened Minoan power and disrupted their trade networks, making them vulnerable to other threats that were already gathering on the horizon. Because while the Minoans were dealing with the aftermath of natural disasters, rebuilding their settlements, and trying to restore their maritime dominance, new players were emerging on the Mediterranean stage. To the north, on the Greek mainland, a warrior culture was rising that would soon cast envious eyes toward the wealth and strategic position of Crete. The Mycenaeans were coming, and they brought with them a very different approach to power, conquest, and civilization. The Mycenaeans represented everything the Minoans were not. Where the Minoans built open palaces that welcomed the world, the Mycenaeans constructed massive fortresses designed to keep enemies out. Where Minoan art celebrated life, nature, and peaceful ceremonies, Mycenaean culture glorified warfare, conquest, and martial prowess. Where the Minoans relied on naval superiority, the Mycenaeans preferred trade relationships, direct military action, and territorial expansion. By 1450 BCE, these two civilizations were on a collision course that would reshape the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans had been watching Minoan wealth and power for generations, learning from their techniques while developing their own military capabilities. They had observed how Minoan trade networks functioned, studied their naval technologies, and most importantly, they had noticed signs of weakness in the aftermath of natural disasters. Archaeological evidence from this period tells a chilling story of preparation and invasion. The Minoans, who had lived for centuries without defensive walls, suddenly began constructing fortifications with desperate urgency. Defensive towers appeared at key sites across Crete. Existing buildings were converted into storage areas for weapons and supplies. New wells were dug to withstand siege conditions. Everything points to a civilization war that knew was coming. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from the cemeteries. In Chania, archaeologists have uncovered burial sites dating to this troubled period that tell a story of violence and foreign occupation. The bodies found there weren't buried with traditional Minoan grave goods. Instead, they were interred with weapons that resembled those used by mainland Greeks. These weren't Minoan warriors who had adopted foreign fighting techniques. These were foreign warriors who had come to stay. The conquest, when it came, was swift and decisive. Around 1450 BCE, destruction layers appear at Minoan sites across Crete. But this wasn't the random devastation of an earthquake or volcanic eruption. The damage was targeted, surgical, deliberate. Religious buildings and administrative centers were destroyed, while residential areas remained largely intact. This was the systematic dismantling of Minoan political and religious authority. What makes this conquest particularly fascinating is how complete the cultural transformation was. Within a generation of the Mycenaean takeover, the administrative language of Crete had changed from Linear A to Linear B. Mycenaean Greek became the language of government, trade, and official record-keeping. Helladic god names like Zeus began appearing in religious tablets. New pottery styles emerged that blended Mycenaean techniques with local traditions. The Mycenaeans didn't just conquer Crete, they absorbed it, creating a hybrid culture that maintained the sophisticated infrastructure of Minoan civilization, while imposing Mycenaean political and military control. The palace at Knossos continued to function, but now it served Mycenaean masters who ruled through Greek-speaking administrators and maintained power through military force rather than naval supremacy. This cultural transformation extended far beyond administrative changes. For the first time in Cretan history, vaulted tholos tombs appeared, burial structures that were distinctly Mycenaean in design and reflected completely different beliefs about death and the afterlife. The egalitarian aspects of Minoan society, where women had participated equally in religious and social activities, gave way to the more hierarchical and male-dominated structure of Mycenaean culture. Yet the conquest wasn't complete destruction. The Mycenaeans were smart enough to recognize the value of Minoan expertise in maritime trade, craftsmanship, and agricultural techniques. They didn't want to destroy the economic systems that had made Crete wealthy, they wanted to control them. The result was a hybrid civilization that combined Mycenaean military organization with Minoan technical knowledge. But this raises a haunting question about cultural survival and identity. If Minoan political structures were dismantled, their language replaced, their religious practices altered, and their social systems transformed, can we really say that Minoan civilization survived the Mycenaean conquest? Or did something essential die in 1450 BCE, even as the palaces continued to function and the trade networks remained active? The evidence suggests that what we see after 1450 BCE isn't really Minoan civilization anymore, it's something new, a Mycenaean-dominated hybrid culture that borrowed Minoan techniques while serving Mycenaean interests. The authentic Minoan voice, the one that spoke through Linear A and expressed itself in bull-leaping ceremonies and goddess worship, had been permanently silenced. Environmental factors may have delivered the final blow to whatever remained of authentic Minoan culture. Climate studies suggest that Crete experienced increasingly dry conditions between 1450 and 1200 BCE. As drought spread across the eastern Mediterranean, water became scarce, and agricultural productivity declined dramatically. For communities that had already been weakened by conquest and cultural disruption, these environmental challenges may have been insurmountable. The combination of military conquest, cultural transformation, and environmental stress created a cascade of problems that no ancient civilization could have survived intact. The Minoans had built their entire way of life around naval supremacy, peaceful trade relationships, and abundant agricultural resources. When all of these foundations were simultaneously undermined, the unique culture that had flourished for over a millennium simply couldn't adapt quickly enough. By 1200 BCE, even the Mycenaean-dominated hybrid culture was struggling. The Bronze Age collapse that swept across the eastern Mediterranean brought down kingdoms from Greece to Anatolia to the Levant. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries suddenly disintegrated. Palace-based administrative systems collapsed. The complex economic relationships that had supported Bronze Age civilization simply fell apart. And so the Minoans fade from history, not in a single dramatic moment, but through layers of catastrophe that slowly erased their unique voice from the world. The volcanic fury of Thera, the invasion of Mycenaean warriors, the relentless grip of drought, each blow weakened their remarkable civilization until nothing remained but silent ruins and undeciphered tablets. Their story reminds us that even the most advanced cultures can vanish when multiple disasters converge, leaving behind only questions that echo through millennia, waiting for someone brave enough to unlock their final secrets.